Alright, it's time for our last lesson on HTML. We need to talk about semantics. The definition of semantic is generally something that is related to meaning in language or logic. So when we say semantic HTML, we're talking about HTML elements that describe or give meaning to their content. An example is the H1 element. We already know that this is the primary heading text of our page. So when we put text inside the H1 element, the H1 element is semantic. Another one is the paragraph element, which is usually used for generic descriptive text that's not super important. But what's the big deal? We could just put the heading text of the page inside of a span element or a paragraph element and then style it with CSS to look like a heading. There's no big difference, right? Wrong. Well, it is technically possible for you to just use divs or spans or paragraph elements for every single piece of text on your web page and then just style each of those divs or spans or paragraphs differently. It's bad practice for a couple of reasons. First, it's bad for visually impaired people who use screen readers. The screen readers get hints about the web page and decide on what order the elements of the web page should be read by using semantic HTML. Generally, a screen reader would give priority to things like the H1 element, which typically contains the heading text, or the nav element, which usually contains the navigation bar of the web page. If every single element on your page is a div or a span, the screen reader works less effectively. Additionally, just like screen readers use semantics to try and determine how best to read the web page, search engines do the same thing. Search engines will make decisions on how to rank your web page on google.com or bing.com based on the content of your web page. And if you used proper semantic HTML, the search engines will have an easier time of understanding your page and will rank it higher. Being higher ranked on Google or Bing will get your web page more visitors, which is usually your goal when you're employed by a company or trying to build your own business. Finally, semantic HTML is usually easier for your visitors to read if you're relying on default styles for parts of your web page. If you don't use semantic HTML, it's much harder for your visitors to read the web page unless you've overwritten all of the default styles with custom CSS rules. Take a look at the example on this page and you'll see what I mean. It's all pretty bad, right? Now, if we were to use the principles of semantic HTML to restructure this content, it might look like this example. Seems a little bit better, don't you think? From now on, whenever you work on your own web pages outside of this course, you get to decide how to structure them. But I hope you take into consideration the people that can't use regular web browsers like us. Semantic HTML makes a big difference for them when they're forced to rely on screen readers. Alright, now that we know a little about semantic HTML, are there parts of our food truck web page that should be changed? Flip on over to Replit and let's take a look. Seems like we used a lot of div elements, right? Now, divs aren't automatically bad. You will use them quite frequently. But could there be a better choice for some of these? I'm going to argue yes. There are a few better options for some of these. But how do we know? Well, we can check the reference list of all elements on MDN and see if any of them make sense in our situation. That reference list can be found at the following link, and you can also find the link in the references section down beneath the video for this lesson. Let's scroll down past the main root section. We already have an HTML element, and then keep scrolling past the metadata section, past the sectioning root section because we already have a body, and let's stop near the content sectioning. Why content sectioning? Because we're trying to replace some of the divs in the body of our HTML element. That's the content of our web page that the user sees. So this is the section for that. Let's go one by one. Address. Do we have an address? We do have an address. Let's replace the div around the address text with an address element. Go ahead and press the run button, and it seems like our address is now styled with italics by default. The only other thing we could do with the address is maybe put a paragraph inside of it. That will give it a little more default spacing, and in case we have multiple business locations at some point. That way each one can be inside of its own paragraph. Good work. How about other divs that we can replace? Flip back on over to the elements reference, and let's keep going down the list. Do we have any articles for the article element? Not really. The description here says that it's for forum posts or newspaper articles or things like that. I wouldn't really consider the foods on our menu to be articles, although it's up to you if you want to switch to those. Next we have an aside element. The description says it's for sidebars. We don't have any sidebars, so let's skip that one too. How about a footer? Actually, yes, I think we have a footer. The entire business information section of our menu could be a footer. Let's replace the div that contains that entire group with a footer element instead. Back down where we just changed one div out for an address element, let's change the div that contains that entire section to a footer. Now the footer has the same default styles as a div, so all this does is follow appropriate semantic HTML practices. We won't notice any other style changes when we run this, but now a screen reader is going to have an easier time, or a search engine, when it tries to read our page. Let's keep reading our references. Header is next. According to the description, it's typically an introductory group. It could contain heading elements, logos, and so on. I'd argue that we have one of those. Our very first div contains the h1 element for our page, and the catchphrase in a paragraph element, and it will eventually also contain the logo. So let's go ahead and swap that div out for a header element. Note that this is not the head. The head contains the metadata of our document. The header, header, contains the introductory content for our web page and goes inside the body. Just like the footer, the header is going to have the same default styles as a div, so we shouldn't notice a difference once it's working, but the screen readers will have an easier time. Flip back on over to Replit, and let's find our div that we're going to replace with the header. Way up here at the top, let's change that to header, and make sure you find the closing tag and change that to header as well. Press the run button. We shouldn't notice any changes, but the screen reader is going to have an easier time now. Back to our references. What's next? Well, we have the h1 through h6 elements. We're already using these. An h group, which we could maybe use with the h1 in the paragraph for the tagline, but we'll skip that for now. The main element, which I think we do have. If we read the description here, it represents the dominant content of a body of a document. What's the dominant content of our web page? The main dishes and desserts. These dishes are currently inside a div which is grouping them both together. I'd say we could replace that div with the main element instead. Let's go ahead and make that change in Replit. Okay, let's scroll down until we find that div right here. Let's go ahead and change that to a main element instead. Now we'll have to scroll all the way down and find its matching closing tag and change that to a main element as well. Similarly to the header and the footer, this one is styled the exact same way a div is styled, so we won't notice any difference when we're viewing the web page here, but the screen reader will notice the difference. Okay, I'm satisfied that we've at least made this web page a little more readable for people with visual impairments by switching to semantic HTML. There's a few other divs that we could maybe replace if we kept reading through the element reference on MDN, but I'll leave that up to you for now. Remember, it doesn't have to be perfect. We're just trying to make people's lives a little bit easier when they don't have the same visual ability that we have. Nice work on finishing this section. We're actually pretty much done with HTML. Congratulations on learning all of the basics. You now know how to mark up and structure data with HTML to make a basic web page. Things are going to get even better from now on because we're about to dive into CSS. By the time we're done learning CSS, your web pages are going to be beautiful. Take a break, you've earned it, then flip on over to the next lesson.